Night folded over Marrowend like a hand closing on a secret. The town's lamps burned low and careful, their light not daring to push too far into the cold. Cobbled streets exhaled old smoke. The river beyond the mills moved with the patient sadness of something that has outlived its own names. Perched on Rosecliff Hill like an animal grown to stone, Marrowend Asylum watched the town in return. Windows like blind eyes, wings of slate and iron, and a long history of doors shut against what the living could not explain. They called it an asylum because the language of law and ledger must justify cruelty with words. Inside its walls, diagnoses were laid down like mortar. Grief was catalogued and sealed beneath tape and ledger entries that smelled faintly of formalin. The keepers wore sober faces and carried brass keys that jingled like pronouncements. Here, people who listened to the wrong kinds of things were catalogued and labeled unsound. Those whose souls tilted at angles the town found awkward were given pills and soft beds and the gentle, efficient erasure of memory. And in the West Wing, in a cell whose plaster peeled like sunburnt skin, the town kept a woman they called insane. Elara learned the rhythms of confinement as if they were weather. She mapped the small things. The exact time the nurse's cart creaked past with its tray of bland porridge. The way the moon fell once a month and painted runes of light on the floorboards, the scent of rain before it touched the glass. She kept a forbidden journal, stolen from a visiting volunteer's satchel and hidden beneath folded hems. In that book she drew and wrote until the nib of her pen was a fine wire of habit, names with no owners, symbols that coiled like questions, maps of streets she had never walked and rooms she had never entered. To the staff it was nonsense. To Elara it was a tether to a reality that refused to respect the asylum's neat categories. Rumor fed on rumor in Marrowend. Children dared one another to press their faces to the iron bars and listen for the woman who hummed. Old men told of how she could speak to the dead and make them confess things they had vowed never to say. Mothers would cross to the far side of the lane if they saw her silhouette in the window, because superstition and caution had learned to walk hand in hand. Yet rumor is often a poor map for truth. If the town's tongues were a swarm, Elara's reality was a single, patient eye. She had not always been a subject of whispers. Once, she chased river dragonflies and learned to read the carved names in the stone of the cathedral steps. Once, her laughter had been a thing that broke glass with joy rather than settled it with fear. Something altered the axis of her life, a loss, a night, a voice, and she had come to understand that the shape of a person can be bent by what they hear. They called her fragile, volatile, touched by madness. She called the word they could not hear, listening. On a night when snow threatened but failed to fall, when the moon was a clean coin hung in the black, Elara sat by her small, barred window with the forbidden journal open on her knees. The page was a scatter of ink, half maps, half prayer, half portrait. Her hand moved, not as a pen and ink exercise, but as if she were translating breath into marks. She wrote the name of a street she had never walked, and then, beneath it, the name of someone she could not remember meeting. Her breath came small and deliberate. The asylum's clock in the corridor made its drowsy talks. Outside, wind threaded through the eaves like a question. Then, the presence. It arrived not as noise but as a cooling of the air, a settling that stole the heat from the room and left a small, sharp clarity where all else felt blurred. Elara felt it at the base of her skull first, that particular kind of recognition one does not expect to have for an absence. The air by the window went still. The moth that had been circling the gaslight stilled mid-flight, wings like a pause. Elara's pen stopped on the paper. There was a pair of eyes in the dark beyond the glass. They were not the bright, startled pupils of an animal. They were older than fear. They glowed with something like memory, a tempered light that did not ask permission to be seen. A hush fell over the corridor as if the walls themselves leaned in. For a heartbeat, the breath between two heartbeats, Elara's world narrowed to those 2 points of light. In them she read not threat first but question, and behind that question, acceptance like a hand extended across a gulf. She felt, with the certainty of the starved recognizing the scent of bread, that this presence had watched her for a long time. It had come from a place where winter was not a season but a geography, ancient and patient, with an ache wrapped in its bones. Where others might have recoiled, something in Elara tightened in recognition. An old hunger of belonging answered across the glass. Behind the eyes, there was a solitude as layered as the asylum's stone, a loneliness that courted myth. In the ward, a radiator hissed and a step passed, and the world resumed its slow, small duties. But for Elara, nothing returned to what it had been. She closed her journal like a vow and placed her palm against the cold pane. Frost bloomed beneath her fingertips, and in the reflection she saw herself, a pale face, ink-stained fingers, hair like the shadows of reeds. Through the glass, the eyes watched still, patient as a sentence left unfinished. Outside, the town kept its rumors and its polite fears. Inside, within a single barred window, something older than their words waited with a kind of careful hunger. The asylum had named her mad because it could not file this kind of recognition into any column. But recognition, Elara now knew, could be a kind of salvation the day Lucien Vale arrived. The sky was a bruised sheet of pewter, and the town smelled of cold iron and the salt of the river. His carriage wound up the lane to Rosecliff Hill like a foreign thing that did not belong to the crooked angles of Marrowend lacquered wheels whispering over cobbles, black horses with monets like ink. Men in the market paused mid-haggle. An old woman dropped her basket and pretended she had not. Word travels differently when it is wrapped in silk and gold. The asylum's front hall was a chamber of ritual and paper. Petition forms in neat stacks, the clock that marked the day like a metronome, and the warden who kept his face fixed in policy. He met the carriage with a brass key in one hand and the steady, official courtesy of someone who understood how favors were bought and how debts were recorded. Lucien stepped down from the carriage as if descending from a shadow made of better clothes. He wore a coat the color of storm water, and his skin had the sheen of a thing untouched by honest sun. Around him moved a hush, not born of the asylum's protocols, but of people who felt instinctively the shape of a presence that could cut through small lies. He introduced himself with a voice that was too smooth to be merely practiced civility. It slid across the hall and rearranged the air. Staff, who had been animated a moment before, fell into attentive silence. The warden smiled the smile of someone trained to receive patrons who brought relief in the form of coin. Lucien spoke of reform and private rehabilitation, of quiet rooms and scholars who could coax the truth from restless minds. He offered sponsorship, select patients, discreet treatment and compensation. His breath smelled faintly of bergamot and something older, like air in a place with no windows. They showed him the West Wing with the clinical pride of people who have long made peace with neat answers. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and old linen. Portraits watched over them, their painted eyes disciplined into stillness. Lucien glided past the windows where the patients sat in their small habitual lives, knitting, staring, humming. And when they stopped at Elara's door, something in the air tethered itself. The cell was unremarkable unless you knew where to look for threads that had been deliberately left loose. Elara sat with her journal open in her lap, ink-stained fingers folded like a bird's. Her hair had decided to camp in a halo of disorder around her face. She looked up when the shadow fell across her doorway, and the room inhaled as if it had been keeping a secret. The nurse with clipped hair cleared her throat and announced, "Mr. Vale, this is Elara Blackwood. She's—" The sentence dissolved into the kind of silence that meant no one could agree on the right words. Lucien's glance lingered longer than was polite. He did not look at the trinkets of madness the staff presented, the shackled history, the medical notes, the columns of dosage. Those things were sterile as bone. He looked at Elara the way a tide looks at a shore, with a slow, inevitable hunger that is also a recognition. Before he could say anything, before the practiced inquiry that would have asked where her fits began or whether she slept through the night, Elara's voice, a small rasp like a thread pulled tight, unfurled in the space between them. "I know your scent," she said. The words were simple. They became an accusation and an invitation both. The corridor held its breath. The nurse took a step back. The warden's smile required effort to keep intact. Lucien did not blink. For a man who had spent centuries becoming the shape of silence, astonishment made an unaccustomed light through him. "You do?" he asked, voice adjusting, finding its customary velvet baritone. "Elara, did not answer with a list of features. She closed her journal and folded it against her chest. "Ash, old sorrow, and winter rain," she said. "You walk where the snow keeps time by footprints left a lifetime ago. You bury things that should not be buried. You have been looking for something, and you tell yourself it is not love." The ward stilled. No human should speak to him like that, not with that accuracy of detail and not with that strange intimacy. The staff had practiced their clinical detachment for decades, but language slipped when confronted by what it could not neatly classify. The nurse railed softly against procedure in the dim of her mind. The warden's training hummed and then, like a brittle reed, bent. Lucien's face was a map folded carefully along 1,000 careful creases. Something in him softened at her words, and for the first time the veneer of composed aristocracy revealed a sliver of something raw, like a breath caught on an edge. "You surprise me," he murmured, not unkindly. There are many ways to surprise the immortal. A child with a caged bird could surprise a man who had all the cages and no birds. Lucien had long ago catalogued the uncommon as curiosities. He had always prized them for their amusement or their utility. But Elara's voice carried a note that did not play for him as mere novelty. It struck a chord that had been dulled by centuries of careful silence. "I would like to take her to my estate," he said afterward, addressing the warden with the courteous gravity of a man offering a gift. "Private suites, seasoned caretakers, a scholar who studies the less visible ailments. My physician will oversee any treatment. Rest assured, it will be discreet." The warden's eyes widened at the implication of money and social favor. The asylum survives on the town's charity and the occasional largesse of those who mistake their largesse for virtue. Lucien's offer came wrapped in the kind of coin that could buy a wing's maintenance for 5 years. Yet the warden had seen men with parchment and good words before. He had turned away those whose wallets were lighter than their promises. He asked the practical questions: transport, guardianship, the legalities of removing a patient from public care. Lucien answered them with that soft, persuasive competence that men use when they expect the world to bend. "Tonight," he said. "I leave tonight." The carriage, he assured, would be waiting. She will have fresh clothing, a private suite, and the care of a man of devotion. His devotion hung in the air like the scent of bergamot. It was almost pleasant. There was a hesitation, a formal hesitation in the warden's spine. He knew the legalities. He knew the risk of removing a patient without sufficient affidavit. The nurse's hand tightened on the stack of charts. The asylum had rules for a reason, to prevent the misuse of vulnerable people. Yet the ledger is patient in its own way. It allows for entries that will erase other entries if the coin is heavy enough to tilt the page. The warden closed his eyes, thought of the roof tiles he could finally replace, the heating pipes he might mend. He heard in his head the small voices of infirmary staff hoping for better supplies. Gold is often convincing where arguments fail. The warden took the proffered envelope with a smile that had the shape of a deal. "If you sign the release and cover the costs," he said, "we will prepare her." Elara heard none of the negotiation. She heard only the word treatment, like a bell that might be tolling a beginning. The moment the word left Lucien's mouth, she felt the world rearrange itself on an axis that included an option she had not been permitted: leaving. She rose with a stiffness that had the habit of a person unused to moving more than within the scope of a cell. She folded her forbidden journal into the sleeve of her tunic, tucked like a talisman against ribs. They dressed her in borrowed civility. A coat pressed from some gentler tailor's hand and gloves that smelled faintly of lavender. The nurse fussed with buttons with the same ritual attention a mother gives a child leaving home. Lucien watched with a small, inscrutable curio in his eyes, as one watches a fragile specimen for signs of life that may prove useful. His fingers brushed the glove as he offered her his arm, an old-world manner that in any other story would mean nothing, and in this one meant everything. Elara stepped into the corridor and into the wash of moonlight that fell through the tall window. For the first time in many years, she felt an expanse of sky above her instead of a ceiling. Moonlight pooled on the flagstones and lay there as if waiting. The cold kissed her face, and for a breath she considered that freedom might be a simple thing. Air, open sky, a carriage's rumble that could put distance between what had been and what would be. Outside, Lucien's carriage waited like a shadow that had learned to be polite. The horses stamped and exhaled into the cold. He lifted the carriage door and offered it to her as though offering sanctuary or a sentence. When she climbed in, he closed the door with a careful hand and turned to the warden, his smile the practiced seal of a man who buys favors without remorse. Inside the carriage, coated in velvet and wood smoke, Elara sat against cushions and looked at Lucien. The carriage rocked, a steady, hypnotic motion. For all his cultivated manners, there was an edge to him, a patience that could be mistaken for leisure but was, in truth, a predator's calculation rendered almost tender. His eyes watched her not with the possessive glare of an owner, but with something colder and yet capable of warmth. The interest of a man who had lost the capacity to be surprised and had found it again in the blue of her wrist and the ink on her fingers. "You surprised me," he said, less a question than a confession. "You know me." "So do you," Elara replied, surprising herself at the steadiness in her voice. "You have been looking for a way to stop the ache." Lucien's laugh, small, almost shy, fluttered in the carriage like a bird that had forgotten how to remain distant. "Perhaps I have," he said, "or perhaps I have been looking for a mirror." Outside the carriage windows, the asylum's lamps slid away, and the town swallowed them like a mouth closing. Elara pressed her palm to the glass. Beyond it, the warden closed the door, and the figures on the hill blurred into the town's habitual uncertainties. Within her, the shadow of a different kind of future unfurled, one lined with corridors not made of plaster and suspicion, but of old wood, fires, and candles that did not run away from darkness. She did not yet know she had climbed into the lap of a thing that both saved and devoured. The moon kept its patient watch as the carriage rolled away, and the wind carried the smell of winter rain, a scent she had named before she had words for it. In the dark, the shadow of Lucien Vale leaned toward her, and the carriage moved like a boat into uncharted water. The Vale estate sat like a thing that did not want to be noticed until it decided otherwise. From the road, it could be mistaken for a bluff of stone and hedgerow, the sort of old house that had learned to be modest by the long discipline of weather. Up close, it revealed a different stubbornness: carved gargoyles, eaves that kept their own shadows, and windows that held back the dark like lids. Candles guttered in brackets along the drive, their flames red as if remembering blood. Elara's first impression was of a house that breathed slowly and had learned to keep its secrets in tight, patient lungs. Inside, the mansion was of another scale entirely. Corridors unreeled on axes that made the mind fumble for a compass. Staircases led to landing after landing, where portraits observed arrivals with the private interest of people who lived forever in oil and varnish. The portraits' eyes were not painted so much as arranged. They followed movement like living witnesses. Elara felt watched without malice, as though the paintings had been instructed to behave like attentive, judgmental relatives. The air smelled of cedar and old paper, and an undercurrent of something floral and iron-tinged that pulled at the back of her throat. Lucien moved through it as if it were his skin. When the servants, few, attentive, and very quiet, opened doors for her, they did so like a procession making way for a private weather. He showed her rooms the way one displays a small, cherished relic. Here, a study whose books were shelved by author's grief. There, a conservatory of plants that refused to be domestic. Further on, windows that swallowed the moon and returned it softened. He spoke of comfort and space for study, and the house agreed with him by offering the right kinds of shadow. Elara was given freedom in a manner calibrated like experiment. She could roam parts of the ground floor, read from the library, sleep under a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender oil. For the first week, freedom felt like the echo of something her limbs had known before confinement. She stretched into rooms as if into an old coat. Lucien supplied books she had never seen, tomes on folklore, on the language of old griefs, on people who mapped dreams as geographies. He sat across from her in the study while she read, and sometimes he would bring cups of something dark and steaming, which he called tea, though there was a tincture of memory in it that made her chest ache with recognition. There was, nevertheless, one door that never opened for her, a thick oak slab set into the lowest floor, bolted and heavy as a thought. Lucien's hand brushed its rim once in passing and went pale beneath the candlelight. When she asked, an impulsive, hungry thing to do, he offered a small, precise denial. "That door contains histories that confuse the living," he said. "It is best left closed." Elara had learned that forbidden doors had the attractive force of truths in her old life. In the asylum, they were the administrative logs and the locked medicine cupboards. Here, the denial tasted like a promise. She pressed the pads of her fingers to the wood and felt warmth beneath it, an old, steady heat that hummed like a vein. The servants avoided the cellar's threshold. Their eyes slid from it like wet fish. Even the portraits seemed to hold their breath when she looked toward the stair. In the daylight of the library, Lucien taught her a grammar she had never been given. How to name the absence that had lived with her. He did not call it madness. He called it listening. When she described her visions, doors opening to corridors not on any map, the faces that rose from fog, names that melted into silence, he did not make the trained sounds of clinical concern. Instead, his fingers found the rim of an old chalice, and with a motion she first took to be ceremonial theater, he brought it to his lips. She watched him drink and waited for teeth, for a hunger to show in the way his throat flexed. He did not draw blood. The liquid was not crimson. It was deep amber, like a memory condensed to a tincture. After he drank, Lucien's shoulders relaxed as if a weight had been set down that no one else could see. He exhaled in a way that sounded less like release and more like the settling of a book on a shelf. They spoke long into nights that were not holy nights, windows clouded by curtains and the thick velvet of the house's design. Lucien told stories in fragments, of cities that remembered the names of everyone who had loved there, of rivers that could not let go of the faces they had borne. He spoke of hunger in terms that were not merely bodily, but mnemonic. "My kind," he said once, "feed on remembrance." The admission came like a bearing of an old bruise. Not flesh, not the beat of a heart. We take what memory gives, and in so doing, we silence certain stories. He let the last few words hang like a confession, and then, after a long pause, added, "It is a greedy, elegant thing. It keeps us whole and leaves rooms in the world where echo does not return." Elara listened and made notes, drawing tiny portrait gestures of faces that swam in her head. It was then she noticed a pattern. The faces she drew, a woman with a chipped tooth, a boy with a scar like a crescent moon, an old man whose eyes were both too wet and too dry, appeared in her sleep with a peculiar insistence. In the mornings, she would find their features transferred to the margins of her books. Sometimes, she would awaken with a scent pressed into her palms, linen washed in unfamiliar soap, the tang of tobacco, bellflowers in early bloom. Each sensory residue left her with the sensation of an interrupted conversation. The more she listened to Lucien, the more she began to suspect that her visions were not random. One evening, she followed a thread she had been drawing for days. A map of alleys that led, in a place that should be empty, to a single locked door. She crossed the study, paper clutched to her chest, and watched him fill a cup from a decanter that seemed to hold dusk itself. "These faces," she said, laying down sketches like small offerings. "They come to me like refugees. I don't know their names until I sketch them. They ask for something I cannot give." Lucien looked at the drawings as if they were small lights. "You are listening to the places where memory lodges," he said quietly. "When I consume a remembrance, I think I close a particular wound. But closure is a selfish thing, Elara. The things we take do not vanish where they were. They become ghosts in other people's minds. Some of them find their way to you." It arriving as an explanation changed the interior layout of her life. The word madness in the asylum had been the blunt instrument of a house unwilling to catalog nuance. Here, madness resolved into a function, a channel in which lost things could reposition. She was not losing her mind so much as acting as a vessel for scattered narrative. Her drawings were not evidence of an illness, but of a trafficking of memory. She felt a startled, trembling gratitude at the revelation. It meant the loneliness that had been inside her was communal after all. The dead and the half-remembered were neighbors in her head, not condemnations. Yet gratitude was cold comfort coupled with fear. If Lucien had fed to silence certain stories, and if those stories surfaced in her, their refugee faces pressing in, then she was, in some way, implicated in what he had done. She wondered how many lives had been simplified into oblivion so that an immortal could be whole. Compassion and accusation braided themselves in her chest. Their conversations became a slow, private court where the two adjudicated each other's loneliness. Elara learned that Lucien had ways of taking memory that were careful and artistic. He did not strip the world as some beasts might. He called what he did an art, refined, necessary. Her impulse was to reject the artistry on moral grounds, but when she looked at the tired lines around his eyes, she found her outrage softened by a grief that was not hers to own, but that she could choose to witness. One night, in the narrow hour before dawn, Elara asked the simplest question that could still hold 1,000 others. They sat by the conservatory's glass, her fingers folded around a cup that smelled faintly of time. "Why did you take me?" she asked. The question was a small, folding knife. "Why bring me out of the asylum? Why keep me here? Why forbid that door?" Lucien's gaze went inward as if to find the right phrase in the dark. "Because your silence sounded like mine," he said finally. The confession was not theatrical. It was the soft alignment of two weary things recognizing the echo of their own shape. You keep what should be said. You gather the world's discarded sentences and hold them without judging them. That is rare, and it is dangerous. Danger was the word she felt in her bones now as well as in his voice. It lingered in the cellar's unopenable door, and in the way his hand hovered near the decanters, as if memory were both a feast and a wound. Yet there was also an invitation threaded through his admission. If her silence had matched his, perhaps their shared solitude could be a bridge and not a gulf. The mansion, with its silent wings and portraits that watched the hours like sentinels, held them both in a shape that suggested promise and peril could be the same thing seen from different rooms. Elara placed a sketched face onto the table between them, an old woman with a moth pinned to her shawl, eyes like folded maps. Lucien traced it with a fingertip, lightly, not as one who would own it, but as one who might be forgiven for remembering it. For the first time since the asylum's window, she permitted herself to meet his gaze fully. In that exchange, there was a fragile, fledgling intimacy. Two battered vessels discovering that their brakes might fit together, not to erase each other, but to form something new. Thunder rolled like a folding door across the sky. The house, which had always seemed to keep the weather at a distance, now took it in. Rain lashed the leaded panes with a percussion that made the portrait's painted eyes glisten, as if they had been crying for years. In the library, where rugs swallowed sound and books lined the walls like patient witnesses, Lucien led Elara to a cabinet whose wood had been rubbed by thumb and time. He opened it with a care that suggested ritual rather than convenience. Inside were papers bound in thread, seals impressed with wax, and a single leather folio stamped with a sigil she had once seen in one of her own fevered sketches. A circle crossed by a slender vertical line. He set the folio on the table as if he placed a sleeping thing there. The lamplight turned the edges of the pages to gold. "Read," he said simply. Elara did not need to be told twice. She had learned the language of old things by listening to Lucien's house. The way a hinge complained when it opened, the way a rug folded its shadow. Now, the documents told a different story. There were contracts in languages the asylum would have burned as heresies. Seals that bound names to obligations, signatures curved to denote sacrifice. A genealogy unfolded. Names that repeated in a pattern like a heartbeat, the blackwood line traced through margins and notations. Her chest knotted with a dawning recognition when the phrase appeared seer line. It was not a rumor anymore, nor a whim of ink. It was chartered. "You are of a line sworn to the old blood," Lucien said, his voice a low instrument. "Long ago there was an arrangement. The seers anchored memory so that the immortals might live without devouring the living. We were given a covenant, a sharing. In return, the seers would not be taken from the world. Their visions would guide the ages." Elara's fingers trembled over the pages. Her mind filled with names, names she had felt in sleep, and now they were printed and heavy in her hands. "Bonded," she whispered, tasting the word as if it were salt. "You and my people were partners." "A partnership, yes," Lucien corrected with a small, brittle smile that did not reach his eyes. "A balance. We took only the fraying edges of memory, the things that had nowhere else to go." It kept us from consuming what is dear to the living and kept those memories from being lost. There was an order to it, rituals, limits, witness marks, until the betrayal. The storm made the house shudder. Lucien's face moved into a map of a long grief. He thumbed a page and revealed a faded notation in a language Elara could not read. Beside it, in a cleaner hand, was a single word in hers: betrayal. He did not have to explain who had betrayed whom to make the word ache. "We were bound to your ancestor. Her name was Maylis Blackwood," he said. "She kept the balance with grace. I was bound to her, in a covenant that was meant to be mutual. But in the end," he swallowed as if the throat itself had a memory of knives. "She broke our oath. She sealed away something she should have shared. In doing so, she saved a handful and damned many more. The old blood cursed me for it. I became something that could not be satisfied by the slow taking of ghosted memories. I began to hunger for whole lives. I learned to close names like wounds, and in closing them I left ghosts to wander." Elara felt the word damned like a stone in her palm. The history on the table was not mere antiquity, it was a ledger of theft and sorrow. "Why?" she asked, not yet accusing, only wanting the shape of the logic. "Why would she—" "Fear," Lucien said. The answer seemed to scare him. "Fear is a decision. She wanted to protect the living from what we are, but protections fail when they are selfish." He looked at her then with the kind of pity that resembled shame. "For centuries I have paid the price. Some nights I thought the wound would end me. There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not show itself in the other person's face, but in the tightening of your own hands." Elara felt it coil in her chest, the knowledge that her lineage carried both blessing and a curse. Her visions were not aberrations anymore, but the aftershocks of a pact fractured by fear. Unbidden, anger rose, not only at the ancestor who had made a desperate choice, but at the centuries of silence that allowed a man like Lucien to become both hungry and remorseful. "Then you brought me here because—" She stopped, the sentence unfinished because it tasted like accusation. "Because you needed to repair what was broken." He held her gaze and did not flinch. "Because you are the last of the line," he said. "There are rumors that a Blackwood persists. I searched until the rumor became a person. You are the thread that could mend what is torn." The confession was terrible and tender at once. "I did not free you by accident, Elara. Destiny is not some kindly puppeteer. I make choices. I brought you because I thought together we might restore the covenant. You, to anchor the memories, and I, to learn restraint once more." The words landed with a gravity that made her whole body recoil. To be chosen is a privilege and a theft. Elara's mind clustered around the notion of being a tool. She had, until now, believed Lucien's rescue had been an act of mercy. Now there was the hard gleam of calculation in his kindness, the bone of obligation at the heart of his offers. Love and strategy braided themselves in a way that made her feel like someone given into fate's ledger. That night the storm climbed to a near frenzy. The house seemed to hold its breath against the weather, and all at once the thinnest strings of civility frayed. Lucien walked to the narrow window in the study where rain made tunnels down the glass. When he turned, his face had the finite look of a man who had made a long and terrible decision. "You do not have to be complicit in my atonement," he said. "I would not." "You brought me here to mend your wound," she replied, the truth of it sharp and plain. "You used my liberty as a lever." He laughed, not bitterly, but with something like admission. "I used the only lever left to me. I knew that a seer's silence was like the quiet that only the dying can hear. I wanted to find my way back." The conversation swelled and then ebbed as the storm did. In the small hours, a different kind of tempest took them, their closeness. It had been simmering, small touches and long conversations that felt like surgery, their fingers picking at the scabs of one another's lives. It was now a pressure that demanded either complete retreat or surrender. Later, when the house had been reduced to the sound of rain and the soft ticking of a distant clock, Elara found Lucien in the conservatory. The glass was misted with the storm's breath. He sat alone among the plants that refused to die under his care, a chalice on the table before him. The liquid within it was the color of old tea. She should have left. She knew the rules of good caution. Do not approach the man who has confessed to a hunger. Do not sit where history might ask for new sins. But some gravities are stronger than caution, curiosity, pity, or the brittle hunger to be known. She crossed the room in silence. He lifted the chalice and held it to his lips, but he did something else first. He pressed his knuckles to his sternum, as if clenching the place where his heart would have been. When he lowered the cup, his palms were pale. The motion looked like penance. He had been drinking not the blood of another, but some distillate made from memories. The ritual had long since become mechanical for him, an attempt to temper an appetite that could not be sated by ordinary means. Elara watched him, and the sight of his restraint, his refusal to take from the living, made something ache inside her with a tenderness she had not anticipated. There are those who hunger, and there are those who learn to starve themselves for shame's sake. Lucien seemed to be both. He caught her watching him. "I cannot take from the living," he said quietly, as if to remind himself and her both. "Not from you." His voice broke in the way a very old instrument can crack when tuned too tight. "You're the last light left in me." The confession, simple and ragged, struck her in a place that had been hollowed by years of silence. She felt in her chest a bloom of anger and a bloom of something nearer to grief. She understood, with sudden, crystalline clarity, that this man had been wearing his shame like a second skin. He was asking her, without asking, to absolve him, or at least to witness him trying. "Then take it," she said before she could think better. It was a foolish offering in a dozen ways, a surrender and a dare and a prayer. She rolled up her sleeve and presented her wrist like an oath. "Take it if it will stop the hunger." He flinched as if at a physical blow. His hands went up, palms toward her as if to block the sun. "I will not," he said with a fierce gentleness. "I will not take from the living. I will not steal what is yours to keep." She saw then how the centuries had taught him to revere some scruples while breaking others. "Then die with my name in your mouth," she said, the sharp courage of desperation crisp in her voice. "If you cannot take from me, then let my presence be the end of you. Speak my name as you vanish like a benediction." For a suspended second, he looked as if he would. The chalice trembled between his fingers, and for the first time she saw something beyond hunger, the desire to be remembered in a way that meant more than possession. Their faces were close beneath the glass-dark sky, breath mingling, the rain a curtain around them. He reached for her wrist, and she offered it like a covenant, not as surrender but as an invitation to shared ruin or shared salvation. When his lips brushed her skin, it was not like the stories. No teeth, no savage claim. It was the press of an old promise being made anew. The motion of his mouth was a benediction and a burn. She felt in that intimate, impossible contact a current like the faint shock when two plugged wires find each other, warmth that was not wholly comfortable and a pain that had meaning. Her world shifted. Light tightened in her pupils until the white of her eyes trembled into dusk. She heard, for the first time as a chorus rather than a murmur, the scattered things that had found lodging in her. Voices rose, names she had only half formed, faces she had traced in the margins, memories of people who had once loved and been taken. They did not scream. They murmured like a congregation at prayer, a low cadence of recognition that threaded through the thunder. Her fingers twitched against his wrist, as if learning their new place. Lucien drew back, as if the contact had burned him, and yet held himself to her arm as if to anchor himself to a living shore. He stared at her with an intensity that read equal parts fear and awe. "Do you hear them?" he asked, scarcely more than breath. She did. The world had widened and become noisier in a way that was not unkind but irrevocable. The house around them seemed to listen, the plants in the conservatory bending as if to hear too. Elara's eyes darkened, iris deepening to something more nocturnal, while speech from beyond the veil threaded into her mind like fishing line into river. The covenant had begun, whether as sacrament or trap she could not yet say. They stood there in the rain-muted light, he trembling, chastised by long self-denial, she altered and no longer only hers. Between them lay the old contract, newly opened, and the weight of every choice that would follow. Their breaths matched. Somewhere in the house an old clock struck, and the sound seemed to mark a moment that both closed and opened a door. Outside, the storm kept its vigil. Inside, in the hush after the storm's first furious miles, two people who had once been separate found themselves braided together at the spine. The bargain was not yet sealed, but it had been begun with blood and name and the kind of intimacy that could both heal and harm. In the darkened conservatory, the first of the whispers came clear enough for Elara to understand. A name, half remembered, half forgotten, a seed for what might yet grow when the messenger arrived at the Vale gate. He carried winter in his boots. He had come on foot through hedgerows and marshes, the map of his path folded into his ribs like a confession. Lucien read the seal without opening the vellum, the sigil of the old blood, a ring of 7 thorns pressed into the wax like a bruise. He did not flinch when the man spoke the words that followed. The council wanted an audience, and they wanted it without delay. The council did not convene in any hall a mortal might have reason to seek. It met under stone in a place where daylight was a rumor. A subterranean vault scented of incense and old iron, its pillars carved with names no one living on the surface kept. Candles burned in wells, and the shadows pooled like old promises. The members of the council were older than the myths told in taverns and colder than winter's first clean edge. They wore their years as armor, slow smiles, deliberate questions, and the kind of cruelty that had patience enough to be polite. They crowded the dais when Lucien stepped forward, an aristocrat still, but one whose gentility had been scored with the wildness of a man who had kept vigil over too many dead centuries. The eldest of the council, a woman whose hair was a pale, careful web, fixed him with eyes that had the quality of ledger entries. They did not rage at him, they recorded. "You have awakened a seer," she said. Her voice was small but carried like an edict. "You have broken the covenant by bringing a living anchor back into the sphere of our kind." Around her, a dozen other voices folded into the accusation, legalistic, archival, final. They spoke of law and balance, of precedents and punishments. They summoned the memory of Maylie's Blackwood not as a person, but as a cautionary footnote, her name a stain on their shared ledger. "The covenant exists so that we may survive without devouring the living," another member said. "By boasting, of a seer, you invite the living to remember what we prefer to be forgotten." His gaze slid to Lucien with the sort of cold that could be sharpened into Chinese letter knives. They demanded remedy with the polite cruelty of magistrates who must not be seen to be arbitrary. Their remedy read like a ritual and a prohibition in one breath. Elara must be executed to restore the balance. The word fell into the vault like a heavy coin. Its echo made the candles bow. "Execution," the eldest repeated, as if the syllable itself were a sacrament. "Let the blood return to the earth unclaimed by immortality. Let no memory anchor us. Restore the order." Lucien's first reaction was not violence. It was the small panic of a careful man whose calculations had failed. He felt, in that immediate shock, the monstrous truth of his predicament. Centuries of habit could not stand against the old laws. He could bargain, he could kneel. He could promise long, slow atonement. But in the face of the council's austere, near ceremonial, finality, bargaining felt like a child's plea. He did the most dangerous thing he could think to do. He named himself vulnerable in a room built to be impervious to mercy. He spoke not as a supplicant but as a defiant man. "She is not to be executed," he said. Silence leapt like a curtain. The council's elder raised a hand that trembled only a little, and in the nuance of her movement there was the recipe of centuries. "You defy the rule," she said. "You believe you may alone interpret the covenant. That is arrogance." Lucien's jaw tightened until the skin seemed thin and white. He gathered himself as if collecting a broken instrument. "I do not lie to you," he said. "She is not simply a seer. She is my equal. Bound to me in ways your law," he scuffed the word law with a small, personal contempt, "has not accounted for. To execute her is to rend the last thread that might return me to restraint." A murmur of cold laughter moved through the vault like a wind across dry leaves. "Your restraint is not our concern," the eldest said. "The covenant preserves the many at the expense of the few. Sacrifice is the mechanism by which the children sleep." Lucien stepped closer to the dais. The light slanted across his face and revealed exhaustion as bone. "Then let me be the sacrifice," he said. "I will stand aside. Take me instead." They listened to him with the civility reserved for those entertaining foolish offers. "We cannot accept a voluntary ending that would unravel other bonds," the elder intoned. "You know the precedents. We do not allow immortals to end the covenant through private repentance. Laws are not for individual repentance." He had anticipated this. The council, in its careful cruelty, always had an answer. Lucien swallowed the retort and, in a voice suddenly low with feeling, made the declaration that would change the night. "If you insist on sanctioning this as an execution, you are sentencing more than one person. You will make war on the House of Vale." It was not a threat so much as a truth. The Vale estates were a latticework of alliances. Lucien's house was not only his, but a lineage of reputations. To move on one family was to unsettle many. The elder considered the balance between law and consequence. Enforcement would be swift, but the cost might be higher than they wished. They weighed cities not just in statutes, but in the ledger of blood. "The House of Vale is not above the law," she said. "We will act without fear of families." Lucien's answer did not come from bravado. It came from the place inside a man where love, contrary to legend, became a weapon. "She is my equal," he said again. "Not because I claim dominion over her, but because the covenant binds us like shared bones. If you slaughter her, you will awaken what we have all feared, fury and retaliation. I refuse to be the instrument of that destruction." So the room hardened into the shape of a war yet unnamed. The council set its face like a stone. Lucien set his like a promise. They did not yet fight with swords, but with clauses and with the aura of law versus oath. The elder left the room with the small, decisive gestures of a woman who needed consultation. In the private moment of her retreat, the vault shuddered with the sense of something ancient misaligning, old pacts cracking like ice. Word traveled, as it does, on the current of fear. Houses that had not seen a summons in generations began to send whisperers. The Vale banner was called to council chambers in the night. Men and women who owed Lucien something, debt, loyalty, or passion, were summoned before hearths and told, blunt as knives, that they might need to take a side. The House of Vale faced counsel among their retinue, to stand aside and let law run, or to stand together and protect one of their own. The choice was a bell tolling in many hearts. Outside the house, far away in the corners of the world where human lives made small, fragile noises, Marrowend's air darkened with the premonition of fire. Elara did not yet know the politics of the vault or the legal wording of their conflict. She knew only the dreams that had begun to unspool from her in waking hours and the new weight of memory at her throat. She began to see images with the insistence of prophecy. The cathedral's spire aflame, the river reflecting a sky that was not sky but a falling constellation, and the clouds above Marrowend torn open so that light fell like swords. They called it, in the oldest of tongues she could not yet name, the night of falling suns, a time when the boundary between remembrance and oblivion would thin, and the world might be burned clean or burned to ruin. Nightmares grew into practical counsel. Lucien tried to shield her from council proclamations, and yet he could not shield her from the tremors of an impending choice. One of the old documents, one he had not shown her, contained an alternative binding ritual, a way to reset the covenant without wholesale execution. Elara's blood, willingly shed, could act as a fulcrum. A blade blessed by oath, taken with intent and offered in clarity, could reconcile the living's claim to memory with the immortal's hunger. That ritual, written in Melis's hand and stained like a prayer, suggested that the seer's will, free and conscious, could be the hinge that restored balance. When Lucien told her, he did not cloak the truth in euphemism. "If your blood is given willingly," he said, "it becomes a bridge and not a wound. It is the difference between murder and offering. The world would remember the seer in a way that need not keep us prey to our worst habits. It is a sacrament that repairs rather than erases." The words sat heavy between them. Elara, who had been called mad for hearing other people's ghosts, now felt the full, terrible dignity of choice laid at her feet. She could lie down and be a balm for centuries of misrule, or she could refuse and watch the council enact a punishment that would strip both worlds to their bones. The prophecy of falling suns did not provide counsel. It only offered a map of consequences. Fire would take things regardless of intent, Whether that fire would cleanse or consume depended on the hand that steadied the blade. She imagined the cathedral burning, the faces of friends and strangers alight with panic. She imagined the river blackened with memory turned to ash. The picture burned into her as a moral geometry. To save the living, she must either choose to die willingly or allow others, immortal magistrates or vengeful houses, to choose for her in a calculus she did not trust. Lucien's refusal to accept that kind of calculus hardened into love's ugly, protective shape. "I will not let them take you," he vowed, voice breaking with a fierceness that had little to do with law and everything to do with his new, vulnerable heart. "If the choice is death, I will not be the one to hand you to it. If they insist, I will do what I must, even if that means I bind you to me entirely. I will not let their blades be the shape of your ending." He meant, in the quiet of that promise, the most dangerous of options. To turn her fully, to make her immortal within his fold rather than allow the council to decide. To some, that would be salvation. To others, a worse imprisonment. The possibility hung in the air like a question mark wrought in iron. Elara looked at him and felt the gravity of the world tilt. She understood, with the steadiness of someone who had been taught to measure loss, that her decision would ripple outward like a stone thrown into a pond. The council had chosen a path of law. Lucien had chosen the path of defiance. War was no longer hypothetical. Houses aligned and emissaries spread like a stain across the map. Marrowend's lamps stayed lit with a tremulous, frightened light. In the small hours before either blade or law could move, Elara closed her eyes and listened to the chorus inside her head. The refugee memories, the faces that had become her midnight friends. They murmured not directives but a kind of counsel. That memory required consent. If choice could mend the wound, consent would be the salve. She opened her eyes to Lucien's face, and in the reflection of his pupils, there was the ache of a man who would choose either way. "We will not let them make this for us," she said, voice small but firm. "If the world must be balanced by my blood, let the balance be my choice." Lucien's hand found hers and held it as if to anchor both of them against coming storms. Around them, in hallways and vaults and the cold governance of the old, the engines of conflict cooled only briefly before beginning their terrible prelude. The council prepared its decree, houses readied banners. Marrowend's people, sleeping or wide-eyed, would soon learn the price of secrets and of love that refused to be quiet. And above them, as if in answer, the stars edged a little closer, as if some dark ledger in the sky was opening to receive the names of those who would decide what the night must remember. The sky above Vale House had been careful all evening, a bruise of cloud that told nothing until it could not hold itself. As the eclipse began, the moon slid as if behind a hand, and the world felt its breath shorten. Shadows pulled taut like strings across lawns and hedges. Candles took on a supernatural hunger, their flames bending toward the thin, silver slice of what remained of the moon. Inside the house, every portrait drew its painted face a little closer to the frame and watched the windows with the attention of long memory. Word of the council's march had been a thing that came on wind and hoof and quiet, well-placed messengers. Now it arrived as iron and ritual. Boots struck the veiled drives like a chorus of law, and emissaries bearing the thorn seal came in numbers that made Lucien's servants shutter doors and speak prayers the household had not repeated in generations. Lantern-bearers formed lines in the hedgerows. Above them the eclipse tightened like a fist. Elara stood at the top of the east stair, a small figure wrapped in a cloak that did little to guard against what she felt in her chest. Below, in the courtyard, the council had assembled its great argument. A phalanx of robed elders, blades honed with statutes, and the formalities of a people used to making judgments into fate. On the opposite side, banners of Vale were raised by those who had never before put their standard at risk for a man's heart, and their faces were pale with that particular blend of fear and loyalty that makes soldiers of lovers. In the center of the courtyard, Lucien stood like a column of one kind of weather. His coat was buttoned, and his hands were empty, and his face was wan with a patience that had become grief by practice. The elders called for ritual, for execution. The house called for clemency, for war. Firelight caught on blades and on jewels and on old eyes that had seen treaties begin and end. The world paused in the space where two sovereignties met. Elara's breath fogged in the air. She had seen enough of possibility in her waking visions to know the shape of a choice when it arrived. Forked, inevitable, and raw. The prophecy of the night of falling suns unfurled in her head like the map of a thing already burned. Cathedral spires split into pyres. Houses were eaten from their foundations outward. The river took on the reflection of a sky that had become metal and fire. She felt, with the pressure of one who has heard too many borrowed histories, that the balance of things would not be returned by paperwork or pronouncement. It would be returned by a body and blood and will. The council's eldest stepped forward on a dais that had been erected as a tribunal. "Lucien Vale," she intoned, her voice carrying the authority of a ledger, "you have broken the covenant's terms. A seer cannot be allowed such freedom. For order to return, the old law must be enforced." Her words were a scalpel. Around her, other voices nodded like blunt instruments. One by one, they recited the sanctity of the covenant, the necessity of sacrifice, the ancient rationales that had kept their kind from undoing themselves in appetites. They spoke as if history were arithmetic and the living mere data to balance. Lucien stepped down from the shadow of his own banners and lifted his face toward the dark moon. "We are not a ledger," he said softly, his voice carrying as if it were a bell rung in a cathedral. "We are creatures with choices. She is not evidence, she is a person." There were cries then, not of law, but of the old, more dangerous things. Hunger, fear, and the rustle of centuries. The council raised its standard, and with it came the ceremonial instruments of unmaking. Blades forged in cold contracts, rites that had been practiced until the hands that performed them trembled with the ethics of habit. They meant to end the problem cleanly. They meant to restore their world's geometry by erasing a node that did not fit. Lucien's allies closed around him like a shield, but shields are thin against law's iron teeth. The council's emissaries began their litany of binding phrases, old words that made the night bend. The elders chanted, and in the chant the air tasted of dust and authority. The house's banners moved with tension. Men readied sword hands. The first blade was raised, a cutting line drawn between choice and imposition. Elara felt the pull of the moment as if it were a literal gravity. She had been given an answer earlier. Melis's stained folio had promised an alternative. A willing blood, given in clarity, could mend the covenant without wholesale slaughter. The ritual required more than intention. It required clarity of will, a conscious offering that was itself an answer to violation. It was, in every grim sense, sacrament. Lucien's eyes found her across the courtyard as the first of the council's ceremonial blades began to hum with old law. The line between them electricized. Man and woman, immortal and mortal, oath and rebellion. He moved toward her as if by instinct and by commanded purpose. "If you will not step back, Elara," he began, but she had already left the stair. The crowd parted not from courtesy, but because they recognized the kind of movement that makes an action legend. Elara walked into the courtyard under the eclipse, the moon's pale coronet like a ring in the sky. Rain had waxed lighter, the clouds thinning into a veil. She felt each eye, each judgment, as a weather on her skin. "You freed me from my cage, Lucien," she said when she reached him, her voice threaded but steady. "Let me free you from yours." The words were small and private, and yet they landed like a proclamation. For a suspended second, the world narrowed to two people and the thin stone between them and everything else. Lucien's mouth opened and closed in 1,000 small motions, as if his breath were bargaining with his heart. Around them, the council found their cue to sharpen their purposes. "Do not be foolish, child," the council's eldest said. "There will be blood whether you consent or not." Elara's hand found the small ceremonial knife she had hidden beneath her cloak. Lucien had not known of it when he carried her in. Perhaps he had comprehended that some choices must be made by the one who would be offered. The steel felt like a small, intimate thing in her palm. It did not glitter. It bore the patina of ritual, the kind of blade used for oaths rather than murder. She raised it with a grace that had nothing to do with easy bravery. The knife's point kissed the hollow of her palm. She thought of the asylum window, of frost blooming beneath her fingertips, of the pair of eyes waiting in the dark. She thought of Melee's and of the choices ancestors make that way like anchors down a family line. She thought of the refugee faces that had found lodging in her, and she thought of Lucien's confession. "You're the last light left in me." Those words had been a confession and a plea. When she cut herself, the shock was immediate and small, the hot sting like stepping into a cold room. Blood welled up, bright and fierce against the pallor of her skin. The courtyard seemed, for a heartbeat, to forget to be a place of law. Silence grew, not empty but expectant, as if the world waited to see what would happen to the small covenant she was offering. She closed her fingers around the wound and tilted her palm toward Lucien. "If my blood can be the hinge," she said, voice almost wind-dry, "then take it with my will." Lucien's face crumpled between the contours of ancient armor and a new, breaking tenderness. He stepped forward as if to take the palm into his own, to receive the offering that might make him whole. But the council's elder made a motion, and the crowd cried out. The laws they had worn like second skins chafed in the presence of this anomaly. Faces hardened, and there were men who moved like wolves to prevent what they had sworn to prevent, a binding by love rather than decree. Lucien acted then as a man who had been pardoned only at the cost of a long penance. He gathered both Elara's hands in his own, cupping the wound and pressing his lips to the blood as if he were performing an old prayer. Whatever he touched did not sizzle or burn. Instead, a cold light passed between them, a luminous thread the color of moon silver. The eclipse had reached its most constricting arc, and in the thin ring of moon that remained, a strange, ancient physics of exchange began. The bloodfire, the council's dread weapon and Lucien's private temptation, was a power that could be called by ruin or by repair. It was a name for the old, dangerous alchemy, light drawn from blood, and blood drawn into light. Lucien had prepared, earlier, to unloose it in an act of destructive mercy, to burn the immortal's hunger until no immortal could feed again. He had loaded the ritual with centuries of restraint and anger, and he had stoked it toward the brink. The council had come to stop him, or to weaponize the moment. Both sides were aligned against the idea of a willing solution, because the willing cut the easy geometry of bureaucratic reprisal. When Elara pressed her palm into his mouth, the current leapt. The air filled with the scent of rain and lavender and old vellum. Light threaded through their joined hands like a river of silver. It did not scorch the flowers at their feet, but seemed to make their petals weep with warmth. Something in the courtyard shifted, blades halted mid-gesture, oaths paused on lips. The old songs the council muttered fell into an unexpected harmony. The circle of those gathered felt the laws of their world reweaving themselves. Lucien's face was transfigured then, not by pain, but by something looser and more terrible: release. The light that flickered through their joined palms did not consume him. It unrolled him like a scroll. The shadows that had lived in the hollows of his eyes softened. For an instant he looked like a man of the living world, tear-glossed and astonished. Around them, other vampires gave a small, involuntary shudder, as if some muscle they did not know they possessed relaxed. Elara felt names pass through her like birds migrating. People once loved and once forgotten, whispering a chorus that was neither gratitude nor anger but a plain accounting. She surrendered herself to the stream of memories she had carried without knowing. To be a hinge was to be both door and keeper. She pressed her forehead to Lucien's, closing her eyes against the brightness that now pooled in their palms. "Lucien," she whispered, a simple invocation, "remember us rightly." He answered not in words, but in the light that poured from the wound and into the moon-slit air. The bloodfire, called by consent instead of fury, did not rage. It reconciled. The thing the ritual had been taught to do, undoing the hunger that fed on unwillingness, was now a gentle, radical reordering. Moonbeams braided into the blood and carried with them the intention she had placed there: to forgive and to tether, not to erase. One by one, the assembled vampires felt the unmaking of the old calculus. Knees that had been ready to strike softened. The council's elders, who had come to pronounce and to be obeyed, felt the rules unstick, like mortar crumbling under a renegade sun. The edict that had been law for centuries frayed under the patient pressure of a mortal's choice. Men in the front ranks began to cry, small and private, as memory returned to them not as a ghost, but as a gift. Lucien's breath hitched. The light that had threaded their palms now rose like a ribbon and wrapped him in a hollow of clarity. In that luminous cage his hunger, the terrible cord of centuries that had made him terrible to himself, slackened and fell away. He did not scream. He sighed, a long, clean sound the house had not heard in a long time. His face lost the gauntness that centuries had carved upon it. It was as if someone had unstitched the part of him that had been claim and cruelty and let a person remain. The council's eldest stared at the scene, and for the first time in the vault's memory, did not know which column of history to file this under. Her mouth trembled as if to form a judgment, but found instead that judgment had new language in it. Humility. When the light finally pulled back and thinned, Lucien's grip on Elara eased. He looked at her as if at something sacramental, and then, with the smallest of smiles, like a man who has remembered how to trust his own warmth, he closed his eyes. Where shadows had been, a gentle, gold-lit absence opened. He rose from the knees where he had almost fallen, and with the limpness of a man who has been forgiven at a cost he did not expect, stepped out of the ring of those gathered. The dawn came then, not timid as in old tales, but as something incredulous and bright, as if the sky were reading a new page and could not hold back its tears of light. For centuries the vampires had not watched sunrise. For centuries morning had been a danger and a myth. Now, the house's slate chimneys caught the first ridiculous colors, and the air tasted of new salt. The assembled watched the horizon break into color and blame and blessing all at once. Some dropped to their knees, not from pain, but from the weight of the revelation that light could be endured, and that a night might end not in slaughter, but in reconciliation. Lucien's form, as if made of both shadow and possibility, began to thin. He did not fade in the savage, mythic way that storytellers sometimes used to end the damned. He sighed a small, contented sound, and then, with a tenderness that made those nearby uncomfortable with both joy and grief, he smiled at Elara. "Remember me," he said. It was the whisper of a man who had been given back a soul. "Remember us kindly." She clutched his hand once more. "I always will," she answered, and the vow was small and vast and true. Light gathered along his shoulders, and where it touched, old hunger peeled away like bark. Lucien's edges dissolved into gold and then into simple air. When the light finished, he was not ash or absence, but a memory returned to its rightful place. Not someone vanquished, but someone set free. The courtyard was quiet, but for the tears and the soft, unsteady breaths of those who had been given a new ledger to learn from. The night of falling suns had been averted not by war, but by consent, and by the willingness of one life to be the hinge. The covenant had been rewritten in the wetland of their hands. The council would have to learn of a statute that began with choice rather than decree. The dawn shone on shattered assumptions and new oaths, and on a woman who had given herself to mend what several centuries had broken. Elara stood where she had been, hollowed a little and brightened more. Her palm bled still, but its wound had the faint, luminous welt of sacrament. She looked up toward where the eclipse had been, and for a second she thought she could see, in the place where the moon emerged, an imprint of two hands joined across centuries. Above all, in the hush that came after the royal, people learned two things with the clean, terrible wisdom of consequence. That love can be a weapon and a balm, and that the true test of power is not its capacity to take, but its capacity to give back. When the asylum finally surrendered to weather and time, it did so without melodrama. Roofs sagged like tired shoulders, ironwork softened into a filigree of rust, and the gates that had once closed with a clang and a ledger's finality now stood slightly ajar to gulls and to ivy. Marrowend had changed in ways the town fathers had not predicted. The mills slowed, some families drifted away, and the cathedral bells learned new cadences that were less about warning and more about remembering. The stone of Rosecliff Hill kept its cold like an old vow, but the asylum's windows that once glittered with accusation now only reflected the sky. People still came sometimes, not for the rituals of fingers and diagnosis, but out of a softer curiosity. Teenagers dared one another to approach when dusk loosened the day. Historians with careful shoes and ink-stained notebooks took measurements and translated ledger entries into cautious footnotes. A few came for reasons less banal. travelers, archivists, those who collect stories like heirlooms. Among them was a man who walked with a staff carved by a hand that remembered storms. He found his way to the West Wing not out of bravado, but because his grandmother had once told him tales about a woman who kept other people's memories in the margins of her notebooks. He found a building softened at the edges, chokeweed crowned over the steps. The door sighed open if you pushed it, and his boots disturbed a dust that had settled like a sleep. Inside, the ward was a cathedral of lost things. Beds that sagged with the impression of time, shelves with broken medicine bottles, a single, stubborn chair where sunlight still fell like a benediction. In the infirmary closet, the man discovered a small stack of journals, bound in thread and marked with ink that had not yet entirely bled away. The name on the first page made him sit down on a crate and forget his posture. Elara Vale. The surname Vale read like an old reconciliation stitched into new skin. The traveler felt that name as one does a warm object on a cold day. Surprising, almost tender. He opened the book and read the first line in a hand that suggested both hurry and ceremony. I have always been the kind who hears what others do not finish saying. I have kept them like stones in my pockets until the weight taught me something about shorelines. What followed were pages that moved between the intimate, lists of the faces that came to her in the night, recipes for tea that kept the memory from souring, and the practical, instructions on how to find certain names in the city's ledger, how to listen to the river when it spoke of departures. Here and there, in the margins, were little sketches. A child with an extraordinary scar, a woman with a moth pinned to her shawl, a cathedral spire that had once been a lighthouse in someone's small world. The journals were not only testimony, they were a map of attention. Whoever read them could learn, slowly, to be present for those liminal things that would otherwise fall through human fingers. The traveler stayed until the light left the ward and the shadows lengthened into their habitual shapes. He closed the book with a reverence the town had previously reserved for funerary rites, pocketed a single small page for his grandmother, and walked back toward the road. He did not know all the stories in those journals. Nobody could in a single reading. But as he left, he felt that he had found something more than curiosity, a covenant of remembering that asked not for law but for kindness. Elara's journals became, in the years after the Vale House's remaking and the council's uneasy reforms, a kind of manual for those who wished to heal memory rather than own it. The council rewrote its own protocols and surrendered some of its old doctrines to committees that were long and polite and very much alive to the new world's complexities. Houses that had bristled at the idea of choice learned the blunt mathematics of consent. There were fits and starts, as there always are when old structures are nudged into new alignments. But the old, absolute edges of law softened into procedures with margins labeled consideration. Lucien's name lived in the journals too, not as a headline or a myth, but as a small, recurring footnote. Elara wrote about him in the restraint of someone who registers both gratitude and grief. She did not romanticize the man made of hunger and regret. She recorded him as one might record the weather, with the clarity of someone who had watched it change. In one entry she wrote, simply, "He taught me that restraint could be learned and that some hungers could be turned into remembrance. He taught me how to keep my hands open without letting what they held be taken." There were those who grieved Lucien in ways that made them quiet in public and furious in private. There were those who claimed his disappearance as proof the old orders were intact. There were others who whispered that a man made of night had been redeemed. Whatever the conversations in drawing rooms and taverns, the truth that stitched most ordinary days together was quieter. A line of people who loved what had been freed and chose, because they were now able to remember without owning. Elara herself did not live at the asylum nor in Vale House for long after that night. The estate became a place of pilgrimage and learning. It housed a small library with cups of time tea and rooms for guests who came to study the new covenant statutes. But Elara preferred the rim of the world, the cliffs above Marrowend, where the land shaped itself into a final, uncompromised argument with the sea. She walked there at dusk, as the sun sent its last letters across the water. The wind there read names from the town below and brought them to her like a chorus. She wore no crown nor badge, but a simple cloak that held the rain and the salt. Her hair caught the light and sent it scattering across the stubble of the heath. Years had changed her face. Time had softened the hard bits where the asylum had carved its initials. Laughter had found new lines to live in. The ink on her fingertips remained, a permanent map. She walked slowly, as if testing each stone to be sure it would keep its place. When she reached the cliff's lip, she paused and let the sea speak. Below, waves worked with a persistence that had nothing to do with laws and everything to do with attention. Elara listened like someone who had been trained by ghosts in the art of hearing. The memories she carried no longer pressed at her like burdens. They were neighbors she'd learned to host. They arrived at the edges of her mind and then moved on, singing their histories into the air rather than clambering to take root. At twilight, she spoke aloud, not because anyone called for an answer, but because words loosened things. "He walks where the stars begin," she said to the wind, and her voice was the kind that had learned to hold both confession and benediction. "And I am no longer insane, only awake." The cliffs held her sentence and then returned it like an echo grown comfortable with itself. The phrase became, for those who knew it, a simple confession, that she had been given back the right to speak of things without being shamed for their strangeness. People took it into conversation, into poems, into the margins of formal histories. It circulated the way a prayer does when it is honest and human. Her shadow stretched long on the rocks as the light thinned. For a moment, she thought she felt someone move beside her in that small, peripheral way that matters only to people who believe the world is layered with more than sight can deny. She turned her head not because she had to, but because old habits of attention die slow. Where the wind caught the hem of her cloak, there was a faint, darker cast, another shape that leaned in a pattern she had once known intimately. It was not a corporeal hand she felt, but the memory of a presence, one folded into light rather than into skin. The faint shadow moved as if in time with hers, not a mimicry but a proof, that a thing you loved could remain even when the thing itself had been altered into meaning. She smiled, a small, private thing, and spoke to the unseen with the tenderness she had learned in the Vale house and in the asylum's ruined corridors. "Remember kindly," she said. She did not speak to be answered. She spoke to be tethered. Around her, the evening breathed as if relieved to be admitted to an old ritual. Once, the night had been a place people used to hide sorrow and law. Now it had learned the softer shape of vigilant peace. The stars opened in their slow, patient way, and the first fireflies came out to read the margins of the world. Sometimes children from Marrowend wandered up the cliff path because someone had told them there was a woman who used to hear voices and who had become, instead, the keeper of names. They found an Elara who offered them bread and stories, and, if they were old enough, a small task: to listen once a week, for an hour, to someone's tale, and then to repeat it back. The practice spread like a gentle contagiousness. People learned, in that small exercise, how to be witnesses rather than proprietors of experience. The Vale Library flourished. The council's statutes were amended with handshakes and footnotes and a tempering of old arrogance. Some vampires walked the dawn with careful clothes and shaded eyes. Others remained creatures of deep night who learned to tolerate the morning as if it were a new flavor. The world did not become perfect in a day or a year. Choices have consequences and people have habits. But the ledger was different now. It included sections titled consent and repair and margins where compassion was written in deliberate ink. Elara lived with those changes, like one who had been given a second language for life, and found the grammar beautiful. She grew older not in bitterness, but in the patient way of someone who had been taught how to mend things rather than to ignore the tears. She kept writing in her journals, and when the traveler's grandson returned years later with his own children, they found more pages and more drawings. They read the little practicalities: how to brew lavender tea for remembering, how to find an old name among directory entries, and the larger confidences, the ones that taught tenderness by example. On nights when the moon was full and the wind descended from the hills like a reminder, Elara would stand at the edge and feel the world draw breath with her. Sometimes she could still sense, just beyond the fine line of sight, the faint shade of someone who had once been hunger and had been taught to be memory. It did not make her ache in the way grief aches. It made him a place of honor in the geography of her days. The night, once tensed like a held fist, learned to exhale again. It kept its darkness the way one keeps a beloved room, dim, respected, and open to those who knew how to enter it without breaking the furniture. Freedom had changed shape for the town, and for the kind that lived between dusk and dawn. It had become the steady work of individuals choosing, again and again, to let go of what made them smaller. In the last lines of her final journal, pages later found by careful hands and read aloud under the Vale Library's modest lamp, Elara wrote, "We were given a choice and we chose to be witnesses. There is no freeing without cost, and no cost is cheap, but we held each other anyway. That is how the night learned to breathe again." She folded the last sentence in on itself like a promise and set the inked pen down. Then she rose, wrapped her cloak about her, and walked out to the cliff, where the wind and the stars were patient listeners. Her shadow stretched long. Beside it, faintly, another shadow moved. A companion in a world that had learned how to remember without owning, to love without devouring, and to let the dark be, once more, the shelter of miracles rather than the guise of fear.